Imagine this. It's a hot summer morning in July 1518. You're walking through the narrow cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a bustling city in what is now modern-day France. The smell of fresh bread drifts from the bakeries, merchants are setting up their stalls, children are playing in the squares. Everything seems normal, peaceful, ordinary. But then you hear it. A strange rhythm echoing through the alleyways. Footsteps. Fast, relentless footsteps. You turn a corner, and what you see makes your blood run cold. A woman is dancing in the middle of the street. But this isn't celebration. This isn't joy. Her face is twisted in agony. Sweat pours down her face. Her feet are bleeding, leaving dark red smears on the stones beneath her. She's been dancing for hours, maybe days, and she cannot stop. You approach her, trying to speak, trying to help, but her eyes are vacant, staring at something you cannot see. She doesn't acknowledge you. She doesn't even seem to know you're there. She just keeps dancing, and dancing, and dancing. This is not a festival. This is not a party. This is the beginning of something that will haunt Strasbourg for months. Something that will claim dozens of lives. Something that, to this day, remains one of history's most terrifying and unexplained mysteries. Welcome to the story of the Dancing Plague of 1518, a nightmare that really happened. A phenomenon so bizarre, so disturbing, that even modern scientists struggle to explain it. This is the story of how 400 people danced themselves to death and nobody could stop them. Her name was Frau Trophia, and she was the first. July 15th, 1518. Frau Trophia stepped out of her home in Strasbourg and began to dance in the narrow street outside. At first, neighbors thought perhaps she was celebrating something. Maybe she had had too much wine. Maybe she was performing for coins. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Frau Trophia did not stop dancing. Not when her husband pleaded with her, not when concerned neighbors tried to physically restrain her. She thrashed and fought against anyone who tried to hold her still, desperate to continue her frenzied movement. Her dress became soaked with sweat, her face contorted with exhaustion. But still, she danced. By nightfall, she was still moving. Her feet had begun to bleed. The cobblestones beneath her were marked with her blood. People gathered to watch, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. Some prayed for her. Others whispered that she must be possessed by demons. But nobody could make her stop. One day passed, then two, then three. Frau Trophia danced without ceasing. She danced through the scorching heat of day and the cool darkness of night. She danced until her shoes fell apart. She danced until her feet were raw and bloody. She danced until she collapsed from exhaustion. And even then, the moment she regained consciousness, she would struggle to her feet and begin dancing again. The physicians were called. They examined her, trying to understand what could cause such behavior. They checked for fever, for poisoning, for any physical ailment that might explain her compulsion. But they found nothing. Frau Trophia was healthy, aside from the obvious damage she was inflicting upon herself through her endless dancing. By the end of the first week, Frau Trophia was barely human anymore. Her eyes were sunken and hollow. Her body was skeletal, as she'd barely eaten or drunk anything in days. Her feet were destroyed, the flesh hanging in strips. But still, impossibly, she continued to dance. And then something even more terrifying happened. Others began to join her. Within a week of Frau Trophia's strange affliction, 34 more people in Strasbourg had begun dancing. They came from different parts of the city, different social classes, different families. They had nothing obviously in common except for one thing. They could not stop dancing. The streets of Strasbourg transformed into a nightmare. Everywhere you looked, people were dancing. Not the joyful dancing of a celebration, but a desperate, agonized movement. Their faces showed pure terror. Many were crying as they danced, begging for help even as their bodies refused to obey their minds. The dancers moved through the streets like zombies, their limbs jerking in unnatural rhythms. Some danced alone, lost in their own private hell. Others collided with each other, creating grotesque scenes of tangled bodies, still trying to move, still trying to dance. The sound of dozens of feet slapping against stone echoed through the city day and night, a horrible rhythm that no one could escape. The city leaders were paralyzed with confusion and fear. What was happening? Was it a curse, a plague, divine punishment? They had no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. This wasn't like any disease they'd ever seen. It didn't spread through touch or through the air. It seemed to spread through something invisible, something that defied all logic. By the second week, more than 50 people were dancing. The city brought in more physicians, more priests, more anyone who might be able to help. But nobody had answers. The physicians could find no physical cause. The priests performed exorcisms, but the dancing continued. Holy water was sprinkled on the dancers. Prayers were said over them, but nothing worked. And people were starting to die. The human body is not designed to dance for days on end. The dancers were suffering heart attacks, strokes, complete physical collapse. Some just dropped dead in the middle of the street, their hearts giving out from the strain. Others died from exhaustion, their bodies literally unable to continue functioning. A few, driven mad by their inability to stop, threw themselves from buildings or into the river, choosing death over the endless, tortuous dance. The authorities faced an impossible situation. They tried confining the dancers to their homes, but the dancers would beat themselves bloody trying to break free, needing space to move. They tried binding their hands and feet, but the dancers would convulse so violently they'd injure themselves even worse. Nothing worked. The plague was spreading, and people were dying, and nobody understood why. Then, the city council made a decision that would go down in history as either brilliantly counterintuitive or catastrophically wrong. They decided to encourage the dancing. You see, the prevailing medical theory of the time was based on the concept of hot blood. The physicians believed the afflicted had been cursed with overheated blood that could only be cooled through continuous movement. If the dancers were prevented from dancing, the theory went, the hot blood would build up and kill them even faster. The only cure, these doctors claimed, was to let them dance it out, to let them purge the fever from their systems through movement. So the city did something absolutely insane. They built stages, they hired musicians, they opened guild halls and cleared spaces specifically for the dancers. If people needed to dance, the authorities reasoned, then they should do it properly, with music and space and witnesses to ensure they didn't hurt themselves. It was a disaster. The music seemed to make everything worse. The moment the bands began to play, the afflicted dancers moved with renewed frenzy, and something even more horrible happened. The music seemed to trigger the affliction in new victims. People who had been perfectly healthy would hear the music, see the dancers, and suddenly feel an irresistible compulsion to join them. By the end of July, approximately 400 people were dancing. 400 people all trapped in the same inexplicable nightmare. The stages built for them became scenes of absolute horror. Bodies collapsing, blood pooling on the wooden platforms. The musicians, hired to help, played on with terror in their eyes, not knowing if they were healing or killing the people before them.
Before we continue with this terrifying story, I need you to do something for me. If you're finding this tale as fascinating and disturbing as I am, hit that subscribe button right now. Why? Because history is full of stories like this, bizarre, unexplained events that really happened, mysteries that still haunt us centuries later. And I'm here to bring you the most compelling, most thoroughly researched, most dramatically told historical mysteries you'll find anywhere. We're building a community of people who love the strange, the dark, and the unexplained corners of human history. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore the nightmares that actually happened. Trust me, the dancing plague is just the beginning. Now, let's get back to Strasbourg, where things are about to get even stranger. The city was falling apart, with 400 people unable to work, unable to care for their families, unable to do anything but dance. The social fabric of Strasbourg was tearing at the seams. Shops closed, harvests were left unattended, children were left orphaned as their parents danced themselves to death in the public squares. The authorities, realizing their music and stages strategy had backfired spectacularly, reversed course. They banned all music. They shut down the dance halls. They forbade public gatherings. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the dancing continued even without the music. Witnesses from the time left behind accounts that still chilled the blood. A monk named Sebastian Brandt wrote of seeing the dancers' feet so damaged that bone was visible through the torn flesh. Another witness described how the dancers' eyes would roll back in their heads, how they would foam at the mouth like rabid animals, all while their bodies continued the relentless movement. Some of the dancers developed a horrifying ability to continue dancing even while unconscious. They would collapse, their eyes closed, appearing dead to the world, but their legs would still twitch and move in the rhythm of the dance. It was as if their bodies had become separate from their minds, controlled by something else entirely. The streets of Strasbourg became a portrait of hell. The living walked past the dancing with horror and pity, knowing that anyone could be next. Parents kept their children indoors, afraid that even seeing the dancers might trigger the affliction. The sound of feet against stone continued day and night, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had taken over the city. Religious fervor swept through Strasbourg. Priests declared that this was divine punishment for the sins of the city. Protestants blamed Catholics, Catholics blamed Protestants. Some said it was God's wrath for women wearing immodest clothing. Others claimed it was punishment for the city's toleration of Jews and other outsiders. Everyone had a theory, but none of it helped the dancers. Pilgrimages were organized. The afflicted were taken to holy sites, to shrines, to anywhere that might break the curse. One group of dancers was marched to a mountain shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. The journey was brutal. Many of the dancers couldn't walk normally, only dance, so they essentially danced their way up the mountain. Some died on the journey, but for those who made it to the shrine, something remarkable happened. Some of them stopped dancing. Not all, not even most, but some. They would touch the shrine or pray before it or have holy oil applied to their heads, and suddenly the compulsion would lift. They would collapse, exhausted and traumatized, but finally free. Their relief was so profound that many of them wept for hours, unable to process that their nightmare had ended. But why did it work for some and not others? Nobody knew. And for every dancer who found relief at the shrine, 10 more continued their agonized movement, seemingly immune to any intervention, earthly or divine. As August arrived, the plague began to slow. Not stop, but slow. Fewer new cases appeared. Some of the long-term dancers simply collapsed and didn't get up again, either dead or too exhausted to continue. Others, like those who'd visited the shrine, suddenly found the compulsion lifting. By September, the worst was over. But the death toll was staggering. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but historical records suggest that dozens, possibly over 100 people died during those terrible months. Some from heart attacks and strokes, others from sheer exhaustion, a few from infections in their destroyed feet, and a few from injuries sustained during their endless dancing, falling down stairs, colliding with walls, stumbling into fires. The survivors were left traumatized. Many could never speak of what they had experienced without breaking down. Some described it as being trapped inside their own bodies, watching helplessly as they danced. Others said they'd been in a trance-like state, barely aware of what was happening. A few claimed they had seen visions, demons, or angels while they danced. And then, as mysteriously as it began, it was over. Strasbourg returned to something resembling normal life. The stages were dismantled, the blood was scrubbed from the streets, life went on. But the city was changed. Everyone who had lived through it was marked by the experience. They'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, something that defied every understanding of how the world worked. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Records from across medieval and early modern Europe describe similar outbreaks of dancing mania. In 1374, an outbreak in Aachen, Germany saw people dancing in the streets for days. In 1463, a similar plague struck Strasbourg itself, a prelude to the greater horror that would come in 1518. In 1518, the same year as the famous outbreak, similar cases were reported in other cities in the Alsace region. These outbreaks all shared similar characteristics. They began with one or a few people starting to dance uncontrollably. Others would join them, unable to resist the compulsion. The dancing would continue for days or weeks, many would die, and then, as mysteriously as it began, it would stop. So what was happening? What could possibly cause hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? Over the centuries, historians, medical experts, and scientists have proposed dozens of theories. Each one attempts to explain the inexplicable, to fit this bizarre phenomenon into our understanding of medicine, psychology, and human behavior. But none of them quite work. None of them fully explain what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. Let's examine the theories one by one. The first and most popular theory among people today is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. When consumed, it causes ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergotism include hallucinations, convulsions, and involuntary muscle spasms. Could the people of Strasbourg have eaten contaminated bread and been poisoned into dancing? It's an appealing theory. It's scientific, it's concrete, and it would explain the hallucinations and strange behavior. But there are problems with it, big problems. First, ergotism typically causes gangrenous symptoms. Victims' extremities turn black and die. Their fingers and toes literally fall off. But none of the historical records of the dancing plague mention anything like this. The dancers' feet were damaged from the dancing itself, not from gangrene. Second, ergotism tends to cause writhing and convulsing, not coordinated dancing. The afflicted people in Strasbourg weren't just spasming randomly. They were performing recognizable dance movements, following rhythms, moving in ways that required coordination. That doesn't match ergot poisoning. And third, ergotism spreads through contaminated food. But the dancing plague affected people from different parts of the city, different social classes, who would have been eating different food from different sources. How would they all have consumed the same contaminated grain? And finally, the most damning evidence against the ergot theory, the outbreak lasted for months. Ergotism runs its course in a matter of days or weeks at most. The body processes the toxins and recovers. But people were dancing for months. That doesn't fit ergot poisoning at all. So, if not ergot, then what? Another theory suggests it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, formerly known as mass hysteria. This is a real phenomenon where groups of people develop similar physical symptoms despite having no physical illness. It's caused by psychological stress and social pressure, and it can create very real physical effects. This theory has more going for it. Mass psychogenic illness can last for extended periods. It can spread through seeing others affected. It typically happens in stressful environments, and Strasbourg in 1518 was definitely stressful. Think about the context. This was the early 15th century. Life was hard, brutal, and short. The region had been ravaged by disease, famine, and war. Syphilis was spreading across Europe. Smallpox was killing thousands. The Little Ice Age was causing crop failures and starvation. And Strasbourg had been hit particularly hard. The city had suffered multiple famines in the years leading up to 1518. People were desperate, starving, and terrified. On top of all this, there was intense religious anxiety. This was the era of the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church's authority was being questioned. Religious wars were brewing. People believed that the end times were near, that God's judgment was imminent. The psychological pressure was immense. In this environment, the theory goes, Frau Trophia's initial dancing, possibly caused by a personal crisis or mental breakdown, triggered a mass psychogenic response.
Others, already on the edge of psychological collapse, saw her dancing and began to unconsciously imitate her. The stress and fear created a kind of psychological contagion that spread through the population. This theory explains a lot. It explains why the dancing continued for so long. It explains why it spread to people who had no physical connection to each other. It explains why the affliction lifted for some people at religious shrines, since the psychological relief of a pilgrimage could break the mental pattern. It even explains why encouraging the dancing with music made it worse, since that reinforced the behavior rather than disrupting it. But there are problems with this theory too. Mass psychogenic illness typically affects teenagers and young adults, particularly females. But the dancing plague affected men and women, young and old, across all demographics. That's unusual. Also, mass psychogenic illness usually involves symptoms like fainting, trembling, or emotional outbursts. Dancing for days on end until you die is far more extreme than typical cases. The sheer physical endurance required doesn't quite fit the pattern. Another theory, proposed by some historians, is that this was a cult-like religious movement. Perhaps the dancers were part of a secret religious group that practiced ecstatic dancing as a form of worship or penance. Medieval Europe had several such groups, like the Flagellants, who would whip themselves in public as a form of religious devotion. Could the dancing plague have been something similar? A group of religious extremists who believed that dancing to the point of death would earn them salvation. It's possible, but the historical records don't support it. The dancers themselves seemed terrified and desperate to stop. They weren't preaching or trying to convert others. They showed no signs of religious ecstasy, only suffering. Some medical historians have proposed that the dancing might have been caused by encephalitis, a disease that causes inflammation of the brain and can lead to movement disorders. But again, encephalitis doesn't last for months. It doesn't spread from person to person through observation, and it typically causes a wide range of symptoms beyond just dancing. There's also a theory involving Seiden's chorea, a neurological disorder that causes involuntary movements. But Sydenham's chorea affects children primarily, and the movements it causes don't resemble coordinated dancing. It's also not contagious in the way the dancing plague seemed to be. One of the more intriguing theories comes from medical anthropologist John Waller, who has studied the dancing plague extensively. He proposes that it was a case of what he calls stress-induced trance. In conditions of extreme stress and cultural belief in curses or possession, Waller argues, people can enter a trance state where they're compelled to perform certain behaviors. Waller points out that in medieval Europe, there was a widespread belief in curses caused by Saint Vitus or Saint John. People believed that if they angered these saints, they could be cursed to dance uncontrollably. In The Stress of 1518 Strasbourg, Waller suggests people essentially triggered this curse upon themselves through their own belief in it. This theory is fascinating because it combines psychological, cultural, and physiological elements. The stress and starvation created a vulnerable psychological state. The cultural belief in dancing curses provided a framework for how that stress might manifest. And once a few people began dancing, the social contagion spread the behavior to others who were similarly vulnerable. This theory explains why the plague affected such a wide demographic, why it lasted so long, why some people recovered at religious shrines, and why it seemed to spread through observation. It fits the historical context and aligns with modern understanding of how belief can create physical symptoms. But there are problems with this theory too. Can belief really make someone dance for days until they die? Can psychological stress alone create such extreme physical endurance? And why,
If this was driven by belief in curses, didn't it happen more often? Strasbourg had suffered famines and stress before. Why 1518 specifically? The truth is, we may never know exactly what caused the dancing plague of 1518. It's possible that it was a combination of factors. Maybe there was some environmental trigger, like a mild toxin, combined with severe psychological stress, amplified by cultural beliefs, and spread through social contagion. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something we haven't even thought of yet. What we do know is that it really happened. This isn't folklore or legend. The dancing plague of 1518 is documented in city council records, medical treatises, chronicles, and first-hand accounts. Hundreds of people really did dance themselves to exhaustion, injury, and death in the streets of Strasbourg. That part is historical fact. And that's what makes it so terrifying. This isn't a ghost story or a myth. It's real history. It happened to real people. People like you and me, who woke up one day and found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Imagine being one of the dancers. Imagine feeling your body move against your will. Imagine the agony in your feet, the exhaustion in your muscles, the desperation in your mind as you beg your body to stop, to just stop, but it won't. Imagine dancing through the night, dancing through the day, dancing until you can barely see, barely think, barely feel anything except the relentless need to keep moving. Imagine being a family member, watching someone you love destroy themselves in front of you, and being powerless to help. Imagine holding your dancing mother, trying to make her rest, and feeling her thrash and fight against you because she needs to dance. Imagine watching your husband's feet leave bloody footprints on the stones. Imagine your child dancing until they collapse and not knowing if they'll ever wake up. Imagine being a city official responsible for protecting your people and having no idea what to do. Every decision you make seems to make things worse. Do you confine the dancers? They hurt themselves trying to break free. Do you let them dance? They die of exhaustion. Do you bring in musicians? More people start dancing. Do you ban music? The dancing continues anyway. What do you do? How do you stop something you don't understand? This is the horror of the dancing plague. Not just the bizarre nature of it, but the helplessness it created. In the face of this inexplicable phenomenon, all of human knowledge and power meant nothing. Medicine couldn't cure it, religion couldn't stop it, authority couldn't control it. It just happened, and people suffered, and eventually it ended, and nobody ever really understood why. But the story doesn't end with the last dancer collapsing in September of 1518. The dancing plague left scars on Strasbourg that lasted for generations. The survivors lived with trauma. Many had nightmares for years afterwards. Some developed a fear of music or crowds, terrified that hearing a rhythm might trigger the compulsion again. Others became obsessively religious, spending hours in prayer every day, desperate to ensure they'd never be cursed again. The families of those who died carried grief and anger. Some blamed the city council for their disastrous decision to encourage the dancing. Others blamed religious leaders for not doing enough. Many simply blamed themselves, convinced that they should have been able to save their loved ones somehow. The city itself changed. Strasbourg became known across Europe as the place where people danced to death. It became a cautionary tale, a symbol of divine wrath or mass madness, depending on who was telling the story. For years afterwards, any report of unusual dancing anywhere in Europe would be compared to what happened in Strasbourg. The medical community was baffled. Physicians wrote treatises trying to understand what had happened, but none of their theories were satisfactory. The dancing plague became a medical mystery that challenged everything doctors thought they knew about how the human body worked. And the cultural impact was profound. The dancing plague fed into existing fears about curses, possession, and divine punishment. It reinforced the idea that the world was a dangerous, unpredictable place where terrible things could happen without warning or reason. In a time already marked by anxiety and fear, the dancing plague became one more reason for people to live in terror. Interestingly, after 1518, major outbreaks of dancing mania largely disappeared from European history. There were a few minor incidents in the following decades, but nothing on the scale of what happened in Strasbourg. It's as if the dancing plague burned itself out, never to return in full force. Why? Again, we don't know. Maybe social conditions changed in ways that made the phenomenon less likely. Maybe cultural beliefs shifted. Maybe it was just a unique combination of circumstances that happened to align in 1518 and never quite came together again. Or maybe it's still out there, waiting for the right conditions to return. That's a disturbing thought, isn't it? Could it happen again? Could a dancing plague strike a modern city? Most experts say no. We have better nutrition, better mental health resources, better medical care. We don't live with the same level of constant stress and superstitious fear that people in medieval Europe did. Our cultural context is completely different.
But then again, we do live in stressful times. We face our own anxieties, climate change, political instability, economic uncertainty, social media pressure. We have our own forms of mass psychological phenomena, conspiracy theories spreading online, viral challenges that lead people to harm themselves, social contagions of eating disorders and self-harm. We like to think we're too rational, too scientifically advanced for something like the dancing plague to happen today. But are we really so different from the people of 1518? They were rational people too, trying to survive in a difficult world. They didn't choose to start dancing. It happened to them. And that's perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire story. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that we're not as in control as we'd like to believe. Our bodies and minds can betray us in ways we don't understand. Social forces can sweep us up in behaviors we never intended. The world can become incomprehensible and terrifying without warning. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Was it a disease, a psychological phenomenon, a cultural manifestation of extreme stress, a bit of all three? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that it happened. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, hundreds of people danced. They danced through pain and exhaustion. They danced through heat and cold. They danced until their feet were destroyed and their bodies were broken. And some of them danced until they died. It's been over 500 years since Frau Trophäa stepped into that street and began her terrible dance. 5 centuries since the cobblestones of Strasbourg echoed with the sounds of hundreds of feet moving in tortured rhythm. 5 centuries since doctors and priests and officials stood helpless before a phenomenon they couldn't understand or control. But the questions remain. What really happened in Strasbourg? What could cause such a bizarre and terrible event? And most disturbingly, could it happen again? We don't have all the answers. History rarely gives us all the answers. But we have the story. We have the accounts of those who witnessed it, the records of those who tried to stop it, the testimony of those who survived it. And through these fragments of the past, we can piece together a picture of one of humanity's strangest and most horrifying experiences. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that history is not just kings and battles and dates to memorize. History is people. Real people who lived and suffered and faced things they couldn't explain. People who woke up one morning in a normal world and found themselves trapped in a nightmare.
People who watched their loved ones suffer and didn't know how to help. People who survived trauma that we, centuries later, still struggle to comprehend. So the next time you hear music and feel compelled to move, the next time you tap your foot to a rhythm or sway to a beat, remember Frau Trophäa. Remember the 400 people who couldn't stop dancing. Remember that there are things in this world, things in human experience that we still don't fully understand. And maybe, just maybe, be grateful that when you dance, you can choose to stop. The streets of Strasbourg are quiet now. The blood has long since been washed away. The stages have been dismantled. The dancers are centuries in their graves. But on hot summer nights, when the air is still and the old city sleeps, some say you can still hear it. The faint echo of feet against stone. The ghost of a rhythm that once held an entire city in its grip. The memory of the summer when 400 people danced and couldn't stop. And some of them never stopped. This is history. This happened. This was real. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it so terrifying.